Just enjoying the music here. Actually, let me do a couple streamy things. This is the main theme of Proteus, which I really like. Hi, I'm Nels, and this is the, I guess, second installment of a show that I'm trying out called Is It Art?, where we play a game and talk about categorical elements that we can use in aesthetics to really assess any sort of medium, whether that be painting or music or movies like film, and trying to apply that to games to see where certain games are really coming through with some of these different categorical elements, and where they might hint at ways that games can do certain things maybe better. And maybe, it's a bit lofty, I think, to say, like moving the medium forward. I don't know if I always like that kind of phraseology. Like, a lot of folks use Thomas Beckett's old adage, fail better. Ever tried, ever failed, no matter. Try again, fail better, as a way to talk about how we play games, but especially a way of talking about how we develop games. And we're still so early in all of this. It bears sometimes, it bears looking into, and there are a lot of different elements I want to ultimately talk about on this channel with how we do some of that. And, this is just one of them. This is one that I really enjoy, talking about art. It's a nice break from talking about how games are sometimes problematic. Okay, testing. So, looks like my recording here may not actually... There we go. I just want to test the levels to make sure that the microphone is good, and to make sure that everyone will be able to hear me, because Proteus is one of those that may not actually... There we go. I just want to test the levels. It's one that has been a little technically problematic, so with that looking good, we can play a little bit with the menu and click the island to have Proteus develop a procedural environment for us to go and explore. I'm going to play a game I like and eat unhealthy a little bit. So, one of the first aspects to art that can be interesting to unpack is the idea of direct pleasure. The idea that you can be looking at a fantastic painting of the Alps, or a wonderful portrait, or something like Van Gogh's Cafe at Night, and that can give you a really direct pleasure. And I see it, like, I've shown a few of Gogh's paintings to my daughter, and there is like a light up, there's a surprise, and especially if this is your first time seeing some of this world and chasing chickens, there is a certain level of surprise. There's an almost visual delight. One of the things that especially Raf Koster, if you look into like game design, he's done a lot of writing on how learning might be in our blood, in our bones, an evolutionary need that we need to scratch. And when games do that, when they help us to learn, even if it's something really not visual at all, like the micromanagement of something like a Civilization game, or the purely visual, like line connecting of something like Mini Metro, that initial struggle to try and understand a new and unfamiliar system is really pleasurable as we start to connect different systems together. Excuse me. That can be incredibly pleasurable, but there's so much to this experience that I find really captivating. And I think it's funny that, like a lot of, a lot of the games I've played, especially these games as service, we played Warframe and asked the same question earlier, like, is it art? To some extent, I mean, and I guess I don't really mean that as a troll. I mean to really earnestly look at different games and say, well, yeah, I mean, if you like shooting big, interesting guns and leveling them up and swinging big, interesting swords in a weird sort of space-faring environment, then Warframe is some direct pleasure. And so while there are other ways in which it works and other categories of art that could tell us and did sort of point in directions where Warframe could be doing better, it's still, I think, really valuable, like, to be able to grab some of these criteria and see what they have to say about the things that we enjoy so that we can understand them better and maybe demand that some of these game developers fail better. If you like exploration, Proteus is a game for you. And if you like this color palette aesthetic, which I really do, like bright colors, neon colors are just absolutely gorgeous to me, this is for you. What I really love about it, though, and this is something that I can't help but talk about every time I start this up and think about, is that there's a really gradual unfolding of what's going on this island and what can really be explored. I've offered this as a suggestion to some developers who I think in general may not have been able to put forward some of that creative experience, that imaginative experience, which is another criteria that we might get to in talking about this. And they've come back to me and said, I just don't get it. I don't understand what I'm supposed to do. Walking around this island was a frustrating experience for me. And I think in most of those cases... Oh, there's a plane going overhead. Sorry about that. I hope it doesn't pick up too much on the mic. They may not have gotten to any of these points of unfolding where things visually, auditorially, and experientially, because right now we're in this experience. We take up space in this world. We're in it and finding things within it. And it's different than every other time we've played it. That's, I guess, challenging for some folks. And, if you find that you're in that category, I'd say Proteus is really one of the best places, if not the best place, to start. So we've got direct pleasure, we've got skill and virtuosity, and a lot of the times this is talking about the brushes being used by the painter, or the notes being selected by the composer. I think when you're looking at the game's landscape in 2008 and what we had available to us, considering that experientially, like being able to think about this idea of this experience they wanted to create, that level of not only knowledge of how to make a game, but what games are, shows me a high degree of that really skill for full virtuoso experience. But one of the things that also comes up, whether by creation or curation or just your skill in playing something like a Souls game, we're getting to the point where content creators, folks like on Twitch, and who've been doing this and like who understand how to select elements for an audience and build that, are also showing to me a really clear level of virtuoso skill. Okay, so going by one of those rocks like fires up the music. And we saw earlier there's this visual indication that something might be over there. But I'm still looking to walk through and explore this island because it's very different than I think some of the islands I have seen before in Proteus. So where are we now? I hope the cursor isn't showing on this stream. It's maybe something I need to disable it. It's maybe just one more sort of thing I need to track a little bit more closely with streams on Proteus. Every game's a little different, and so that gets into how maybe a streamer could be highly skillful in how they are technically setting up a scene, but also using that experience to create something that is uniquely powerful, however that is. If it's really funny, if it is really informative or shows a lot of skill. I've really enjoyed applying that concept to this whole landscape, which is not a landscape I really had seen before. Like, I'm really enjoying, just if for no other reason, just to see how it works. Like, I'm enjoying looking at Twitch. It's starting off as just a way to, I love this sandbar. I don't think I've seen something like this before, or like such a separation in the islands. This is a cool island. And we walk on water. That's interesting. Starting off as something to do while the Corona no gave me some really intense insomnia. I got I think a good look at some of this stuff, and it's been fun to sort of expand that. We'll see. It would be cool if this is something that I have the space and the place to keep doing. So we were talking about unfolding. We have found something that I typically call the fairy ring, where you've got a circle of these standing stones, and when you find this, there are different qualities. They don't just make these nice bassy sounds. But if you step into the ring itself, you start to experience some of this unfolding. The system may start out looking one way, but we go from spring into summer. One of the things that may increase my enjoyment, I know not everyone has robot ears, but I do, and I love the notions of procedural music and constantly play with some of these ideas in my own games. And while I think, there has been some room to pursue ideas of procedural music, like for its time, Ed Key and David Kanaga are doing some really cool stuff here in terms of how they're developing that music, but also designing it. Oh, hey, a squirrel. Squirrel. So one other element that we could talk about is style. And it's very often easy to mistake this just for visual style, which, as mentioned, I like this game's visual style. But we walk by some bees and suddenly we are running away from bees. Oh, they're still coming for us. We're going so fast. Okay, they've flown back. Style, I would say, has a really interesting place in games because, while we would usually look and say, yes, okay, color palette, maybe a unique take on some of that Minecraft aesthetic, okay. The procedural music, absolutely. Stylistically, really wonderful. That's such a big standing stone over there. It's got like that hook to it, which I don't know I've ever seen one quite like that before. What's starting to happen as we go through and explore, and there's this term that I call resonance that's talked about by Brenda Romero. Previously Brenda Brathwaite, I say, because her GDC talk on her game Train talks really wonderfully about what happens when things like the art and the sound and all these other elements that we're used to talking about aesthetically, when they all align with the experience. And I think that's what's happening in Proteus. I would say there's a real strong resonance between all the... What? What is that? I don't think I've seen this before. What happens if I... Little summer dragons. Cool. And I'm actually just deciding whether or not I want to follow these guys and They're deciding whether or not they want to be followed, or if they want to just fly off into the sunset. Getting some perspective on this island, it's really unique. And the sun is no longer shimmering, it's going down. The moon's coming up. Ralph Coster has talked about, this idea that the systems level, like the experience of it, or maybe more accurately, like what Ian Bogost means when he talks about procedural rhetoric, which basically just means, the systems of games. Like in rhetoric, this idea, how do we formulate good speaking? How do we formulate, good pieces of art? And we have different rhetorics for different mediums. We also have this fairly new understanding of how we create rhetorics of games, of the systems behind them. And when those systems are in alignment, you get a level of experience that goes beyond what we typically get in big budget games. And I'd say certainly games as a service. When a game is trying to keep you logged in as a service, especially if that's for some monetary profit, they're essentially making it hard to create these contextualized moments, these resonant moments where things just align and we start to fall in and really have an experience where we can really appreciate the beauty of a world. So that gets us to another category of art, novelty and creativity. And you can have that visually. Again, you can have that with the audio, but there are experiences that I would say are really overdone. And part of that comes out of, if you're going to spend $200 million on a Modern Warfare, or, a FIFA, or a Football Manager, or even more than that, and you're going to spend hundreds of millions of dollars as well on the marketing of that. The kinds of businesses that have that much money want to see a return on their investment. And that's natural. Like, I don't know that we can really begrudge businesses of that magnitude with responsibilities to so many shareholders and stakeholders wanting to do that. Wanting to have that return so that they can continue to pay employees and pay out. But creatively, and especially in terms of novelty, you're necessarily going to stagnate because you're looking at marketing demographics. You're looking at, like things like, what do males aged 18 to 35 play? How do we really emphasize those things? And necessarily, if we're going to ask those questions and answer them, we're going to be talking about things that are already established. What am I hearing? Hello. Whoa. I think that's the kind of monolith that usually pops up really high up. What was I hearing over here? Is it still here? Huh. I don't know what that sound is. I hope the audio is such that you can hear that. It must be these crabs. Oh yeah. Cool. Oh, it's like gooey ducks. Or just like little clams. It's cool. I didn't know that could happen. I thought it might be tied to this tree because, I mean, no spoilers, but that's a very large, very interesting tree. Okay, here's another one of those monoliths. So one's down there maybe, or maybe that's a stump. Just in terms of appreciating electronic music, I just really enjoy a lot of these transitions. And the fact that this is like auditorially working. Stylistically, like the imagery is very suggestive of, you know, a certain experience of the stars. And the fact that it's me stepping in and sort of playing with those little guys. What am I hearing? Oh, hey. Hi, guys. It's like the moon's going down and the sun's coming up. I love this. It's almost like a philharmonic orchestra just chiming in as the moon goes down and the sun comes up. Which, I mean, the next criteria of art we usually talk about is critical establishments. And we could, but I feel like this is a really wonderful time to talk about representation, which would be the next categorical element of art. If we're looking to say, you know, if Proteus is art, then how? But this next element would be representation, which is typically the idea that in a painting you could represent something that's happening in the world, something powerful. That in a song you could represent, and many of the classical composers are trying to represent nature in different ways. What Proteus, from what I understand, is trying to represent is the works of the naturalist John Muir, who wanted to say, oh shoot, I just chased that frog into the water. He'll be okay. I mean, he's in there, right? Let's just see if we can chase him back out. Oh, he'll be fine. Now I feel that was a little tragic. Have all these frogs and all this water. I do not want to chase them any longer. That is the goal, to be able to represent a walk in nature and something unexpected and something beautiful is, I think, so wonderfully executed here in this procedural island that you can just wander around in. That I have to say, you know, especially coming back to that other categorical element we talked about, you know, like with the idea of resonance, that all these different elements, the visuals, the audio, the experience itself, are all coming together and aligning, I think really does quash one of the biggest criticisms to games as art, which famously came from Roger Ebert, when he said games could never be art, because they could never have directorial voice. They could never have that director at the center that is making sure everything aligns. This aligns. And yeah, a couple new people in chat. If you guys have questions, I'm just playing Proteus and talking about some different categorical ways that aestheticians who study this sort of stuff in other fields, what they talk about and how that can be applied to games. And I'm really just kind of having fun with it and just shooting from the hip here. So we have now transitioned into fall. And this might be a good time to come back to the idea of critical establishments, because we got into the idea of Roger Ebert and what he was trying to say. One element to art is that you have critics. For instance, Ebert for film, or art critics, audio critics, creating like an understanding of taste and what's good and what could be better. And we have those. We unfortunately have had some really wonderful ones in the last 20 years that weren't supported, and we're doing wonderful writing and video work for games that, was marginally supported by Patreon and other sort of avenues like that for a while. And then that stopped happening, and they couldn't afford to do it. Folks like Kara Ellison, she was making, in my mind, some of the most soulful writing about games, and now I think is working on writing in the industry. And we're returning to this graveyard, and we're getting a really different level of audio. So once again, we have all these elements really aligning. There's flowers that just seem to be growing. And I don't know if it's coming through as you watch this, but as I play through this experience right now and just sort of transition, even with the audio, but it's more than that. It's the experience of going into this thing that to me is symbolizing a graveyard, and there's a little bit of room for interpretation. But I had just the chills really hard, and this is one of those things, I think John Blow said that if you can get a really good experience of a song in 2 minutes, and that's a great experience. If you can get a really wonderful experience in 2 hours watching a film, then why do games need to take 40 hours? And, now that games as a service are so popular, why do they need to take 2,000 hours and counting? And we still get good experiences there, and I think it's worth saying here too, since we've talked about Ebert, one of the things he said he liked to quote Pauline Kael, a film theorist, who would say, not every movie is going to be great art. And if we can't also enjoy great trash, we have no reason to go. Which, I love that. And I love that for games, because there are times where, we said is Warframe art earlier today. It was kind of fun. And, in the same amount of time it takes to play through Proteus, we went and kind of leveled halfway up on one of our Warframes. And it was enjoyable in its own way. But when you look at some of what's being accomplished in the aesthetic realm by something so much less challenging to... not less challenging to code, you need to understand a lot. Oh my gosh, the sound on that made me think that something was ringing, and I'm getting some like new auditory elements that I don't think I've ever experienced, and I love playing through this game, and so to have gone through it so many times and find something new like expressive surprise definitely bodes well. Like, gives this, I think, a pretty high ranking when we're talking about whether or not this is art, which, if we can skip ahead a little bit, definitely one of those other categorical elements is emotional saturation. That I can walk into a graveyard and feel chills. That we're getting the same orchestral rise again, and it's just so visually beautiful. As an experience, though, it's something more. It's something that I think only games could uniquely do. You can get close if you're watching something and it has that, that other element representation. If it's representing an experience that speaks to you, certainly film, poetry, that can grab you and pull you in and put you into that experience. But this is different and deserves those again, critics and critical institutions all its own to talk about this sort of stuff. So one of the other things, just briefly, while we're on critics, is special focus. Ooh, hey. Oh. What is that cluster of stars, even? When you have games, say Ian Bogos' Slow Year being shown in an art gallery, or games in the Smithsonian, you have reached the point... Whoa. Okay. You have reached the point of putting that extra level of focus on something, and this is something that, you see it maybe in an art museum, if you've ever gone to one where, you've got culturally relevant statues on plinths. Whoa. What was that? I don't think it was that. I think something was running away from us. Cool. I could see playing this in a museum. Whoa, it's like flapping its arms. And it's mumbling. What, is that the same thing? It's pretty cool. I hope, again, there are a couple folks that looks like watching live. If you have questions, fire them off. But if you are watching this live or later, I hope this is maybe inspiring you to try out this game if you haven't already. Certainly, this is something that if it was in a museum and you could just pick it up, you could have an experience. And I'm trying to think of maybe the closest thing I've ever experienced wasn't at a museum, but it was at the GDC, where I got to play at the IGF showcase. I think it's Aurelia Harvey and Michael Samin's Luxuria Superbia, while they were both standing there watching me play it. And that is unique in that it's a very it's a sensual experience, which is something you really don't see in games. I'm gonna walk here and see if I see the fairy ring. But having that, sort of put up, not on a plinth, but in its own little booth, so that you can play it and have that experience. It is something special, and it is a marker. It is just one more of those categorical ways that we can say maybe something is art. Um, so you get another expressive individuality. And I would say that this is probably related very strongly with like the idea of emotional saturation here. But you see it really strongly in, say, a game like Anna Anthropy's Dysphoria, where she has said this is an experience for trans women. This is about my experience, and it's to try and help other people understand what I went through. And she has, because for a while it was being used, because it is so strong with that idea of expressive individuality. Folks were using it as an example of like empathy games, which was whoa, what is this on the clouds? Just like, what are they doing? Are they passing through the Aurora Borealis? So it must not be Aurora Borealis. That's neat. And it's all procedural, so I mean, you could look at that as clipping, or you could try to think of what clouds passing through an Aurora Borealis might mean to you in the context of this experience. And I love that shade of pink we get. What I said of dysphoria, and I think from the brief exchange I had with Anthropy about it, she was okay with, like, I said it wasn't for me, meaning like it wasn't made for me. And I don't think I looked at it as an empathy game, meant to help expand my perceptions to understand that story. But if that is something you get out of it, like, awesome. To me, and it's done. It was, as someone who is coming from, a long history of trying to grapple with, kind of the peculiar place that I fit in the queer community, it was powerful to me for certain reasons. And, I said dysphoria might not have been for me, but I still really enjoyed it. One other element that we get in games sometimes, and sorry for the freeze there, is intellectual challenge. And you see that really strongly in maybe a painting like the Night Watch, where you have what looks like a portrait of, a bunch of Dutch nobles and other folks who make up this Night Watch, the kind of portrait that would be common at the time. But when you understand what's really being said with the visual language, it takes on a lot of extra meaning, and there's a real unpacking that happens. And you absolutely see this in games like, World of Goo is an example that I like, where it's putting together a lot of different sorts of puzzles. Oh, look at that, like, halo around where that big tree is. That's neat. I mean, again, you can look at that in terms of like, is that clipping? But you can look at that in terms of like, especially given the backdrop of this game, like, what does it really mean? Anyway, where were we? Yeah, intellectual challenge. I think, though, one of the things we talked about earlier was, the experience of folks who try a game like Proteus and they're like, there's no quests. What am I supposed to do? This game sucks. Like, part of intellectual challenge can be trying to unpack an experience to see why it's beautiful and what it's for. I think that's pretty awesome. And so I think that, especially if we're looking more in the way that traditional aesthetics would have us, say, picking apart a painting, Proteus may actually classify in much more traditional ways than, say, some other things that we could experience aesthetically. Finally, talking about art traditions and institutions, which would be highly related to that special focus, that sort of, it's the museum that's putting something on a plinth, that's, inviting Ian Bogos to come present a slow year. Those institutions, also connect to things like critical writing, and like we may need to revisit a lot of how those institutions are funded so that we can feed back to developers in the industry what's really working in terms of art. But they exist, and they are at the very least a work in progress. We have them, and Bogost himself has written a wonderful piece on Proteus where he looks at it from 3 different perspectives. And we have begun to float. The final categorical element that we could look at is imaginative experience. And, sorry for freezing it there a little bit. And this is stuff like cosplay, stuff like Boat Murdered, if you're familiar with the piece of writing that was attached to Dwarf Fortress, which for a long time was, one of the most interesting pieces, or was not the most, but a very interesting piece of user-generated content. But now we're doing user-generated content. Imaginative experience, like we may not be cosplaying Proteus. However, just before we make it back to the graveyard, we go up into the clouds. Even that, like, I'm narrating this experience. I'm having this experience right now. But also creating something of my own that utilizes, a bunch of maybe cheeky rambling to try and create a video that pays homage to something, but also maybe looks at how are we doing this? Like, how are we doing games? And how can we do them? And it feels pretentious sometimes. What is that going up? It's not the same color as all these other stars. I'm going up. I'm still floating. What am I to understand about this one moving star? I don't think I've ever noticed one of those before, just like a moving light going across the horizon. So that's it. Whereas I didn't necessarily know if Warframe fit all of these categories, although we're not done with Warframe. We got about halfway through it. We got through 12 categorical elements of art, though, here with Proteus. Oh, sorry. Had a little experience where we at one point got the chills because of what all these elements were doing. And it's gone. And I think soon, so are we. Off in the distance is that very large tree. And we can bid it adieu. I didn't tear up though, so that's probably good. That would have been embarrassing. There was one where the audio was all messy, and I did not include it. And now we have completed our journey with Proteus. Thanks everyone if you followed along, and if you've watched this later, I hope it was interesting. That's my stream. We've got the music. It's a nice closing music for, again, those of us with robot ears. All right, good night.